So I'm thrilled to be introducing Rob Halpern to you this morning, and I want to add a few words of thanks to the ones that Greg Mullins just gave you. In particular, I want to thank Julie Ron and Shah Osha for supplying crucial infrastructure for the Art Lectures series. And I also want to thank Dee Wallach and Elizabeth Williamson for helping to coordinate our guest's visit. Also, a big thanks to Greg Mullins and the library's Daniel Evans reading series, and also to a little coordinated studies program called Literary Arts Toolkit for co-sponsoring this morning's reading. Today's guest comes to us from Ypsilanti, Michigan, where he teaches at Eastern Michigan University, as well as at a prison down the road. He is the author of many books and chapbooks of poetry and numerous essays as well. I'll only mention the two most recent books, Placeholder and Commonplace. I see there's another one here that I'll just pilfer for a moment and hold up. It's called Music for Porn. He has a PhD in comparative literature from Santa Cruz and a BA from the Evergreen State College. Rob Halpern's writing tests the limits of our language, the limits of our knowledge, the limits of our action. It reminds us of the ways in which our desires are laced with power and forces us to rethink both of those categories, to rethink power, to rethink desire. This is how capital explodes in song, he writes. And to see how that happens, you'll need to read or hear him read his work. His poetry forces us to unlearn just what it is we think we know it is that poetry does or can do, and invites us to imagine other possibilities, including possibilities we may not even yet know how to conceive. This is how capital explodes in song. In that announcement, I can't help but hear Louis Zukofsky's definition of poetry as a mathematical equation, an integral, to be precise, in which the upper limit is music, the lower limit is speech. In Zukofsky's way of understanding poetry, poetry slides between speech and song, between the rhetorical and the political and the persuasive on the one hand, and the musical, erotic, and sublime on the other. The poem is also an instrument for frustrating these categories and for giving us a means to rethink them. So let's keep Zukofsky's integral in play. We can think of it as an axis, upper limit music, lower limit speech, and add another pair of axes. I know you thought you were coming to a poetry reading, and it sounds like this is about to turn into a math class, but I hope you'll indulge me. I think of my encounter with Rob's work along these three lines. The second axis has to do with what a poem is. The poem is that which does not fit the measure. This is how the mid-20th century poet Paul Celan defines the poem in his notebooks. It's a counterintuitive claim, especially if we think of the role of meter, of measure, in poems. Be that as it may, let's have this suggestive definition at one end of the spectrum. The poem is that which does not fit the measure. At the other end, let's place Giorgio Agamben's insight into the roots of the word troubadour. 12th century troubadour love poetry being one of the roots of the Western European lyric tradition. Agamben argues that the word troubadour comes from the Provençal phrase raso de trobar. Trobar means to seek, and raso has its root in the word ratio. So to be a troubadour is to seek the ratio. Agamben's here is that the poet uses the poem to find the measure, ratio as a kind of measurement. Perhaps the very measure that Celan writing at the other end of history, says the poem does not fit. So we've got music and speech and the poem not fitting the measure, and the poem as a means for seeking the measure. And then the last axis I want to add, this goes back to the first time I met our guest, which was at Bard College in the summer of 2006, where we were both working. This was 10 years ago next month. We'd been reading Lucretius, the ancient Roman poet, who anchors the possibility of human free will in the fact that the atoms that compose the universe, as he describes it, periodically swerve and collide. And as a consequence, humans are actually not determined in their action, but can take free action. We'd also been reading a text on the history of physics and on the laws of thermodynamics in particular, by Prigogine and Stengers, I think it was. Our very first conversation was about the idea of entropy. The idea that as you organize the universe, you also disorganize the universe. As you put work into something, you also inevitably and invariably increase chaos somewhere else. There's a proportional relation between energy and entropy. This is my crude recollection of how this goes. As a consequence, the volume of entropy is constantly increasing. So that's what's at either end of this next axis, which I guess needs to go this way, energy and entropy. So what we were excited about in our conversation was the idea that the word entropy has the word trope in it. The word energy has the word ergos, or work, in it. So to produce energy is to put work in. And to produce energy is to put tropes in. Tropes in the sense of a turn or a transformation, like a turn of phrase or a figure of speech. I forget exactly how that conversation landed, but remember vividly how excited we were 10 years ago by the idea of entropy, or the increase of chaos, that this idea was what made it possible to proliferate metaphors and to cultivate tropes, to introduce swervy curves into the language. I feel like I'm still having that conversation with Rob, thinking about the labor of transformation, both on and off the page, and I'm thrilled to welcome him back to the Evergreen State College. One word before the reading begins, there'll be a Q&A, and to ask your question, there's a microphone over here, and the request is that you use it so that the rest of us can hear and it can be recorded for posterity. And with that, let's welcome Rob Halpern.
Hi, everyone. I hear my voice. I imagine you hear it too, yes? Yeah. All right, that's a good start. I don't think anything I say over the next hour and 20 minutes will be nearly as eloquent as what you just heard. So I want to express my deep gratitude to Eirik. Thank you. Beautiful introduction. As well as to Miranda Mellis and Dee Wallach and Elizabeth Williamson and everyone else who had a hand in bringing me here. And it's really, really wonderful to be back. I graduated from the Evergreen State College in 1989. And if things go remotely according to some vague semblance of plan that I have, I will be talking about that or sharing some of my recollections of my experience here with you toward the end of my presentation. So just to give you a heads up, when I was anticipating being here and talking with you, I gave myself permission to risk something that I don't often do, and that is to extemporize, as I've begun to do right now. I don't really know what I'm going to say to you. I have some ideas, but I really do want to leave it open and porous and available for your engagement. I can't see you all very well because of the lighting, but I do mean it genuinely when I say, if there's a moment when I'm pausing and you feel moved to say something or shout something out or provoke me or ask me a question, there's no need to wait until the official Q&A period at the end of the talk to do that. So I know that's difficult sometimes to do, but if you do feel moved, please don't hesitate. So actually, touching on something that Eirik referred to in his introduction, a question as to what poetry can do. What can poetry do in relation to states of crisis, catastrophe, that other forms of discourse, say, cannot do, right? I think that's a really great question to keep in mind. Why poetry? In many ways, that's just an extension of a question like, why art? Like, what do we need art for? Especially when we're thinking about, perhaps the most egregious forms of state violence, for example, about which much of my work has been concerned. Right? What is it that poetry can do in relation to states of crisis and institutional violence that other forms of discourse can't do? Why poetry? Why art? So I thought I would begin just by cueing your attention to just two ideas, maybe keywords, concepts, questions that have informed my work for quite some time now. And I'm assuming maybe a third of you have had some engagement with my writing, but I'm not going to presume anything. So the first thing refers back to something that Karl Marx wrote in what often goes under the title of the 1844 Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts. So this is work of the younger Karl Marx. He's sort of just beginning to rev up his engine, thinking a lot about Hegel, perhaps beginning to anticipate the critique of capitalism that would come soon thereafter. And he's talking about the human body and the capacity of the human body to sense the world within which it is living, right? So he's talking specifically about the human sensory apparatus and thinking about that historically, right? So disabusing us of our illusions, say that senses, whether we're talking about vision, smell, auditory, touch, are somehow natural, right? That we sense the world naturally. And Marx wants to propose that, in fact, the way in which the sensory apparatus in the human body emerges is historical. It's profoundly historical. It's shaped by the conditions within which the human body finds itself. Right? So as an extension of that proposition, Marx talks about the ways in which the sensory apparatus, and if I'll try and recall this by memory, but my formulation will probably be slightly off the mark. The way in which the human senses are capable of theorizing themselves in their very praxis, right? So Marx is bringing together the idea of theory, the idea of praxis as mediated by sensation. That's always struck me as being profoundly interesting. And maybe just to offer another qualifier as to why that's significant for Marx. Marx is beginning to think about, say, the relationship between a human body working in a factory, right, and the machines that human body is responsible for operating or engaging with. Right? So the idea that Marx wants to propose is that there's something about human sensation, right, that can allow us to experience something that we can't think. That the sensory apparatus in the human body works in advance of cognition. Right? And the idea here is that Marx wants to propose that there's something privileged, right? Given the fact that factories are emerging in a way that will begin to dominate economic production, there's the worker who actually has his or her hands on the machines, right, is in a privileged position, right, to begin to sense something about the world in which we live that perhaps we can't yet think. Right? Okay, so I thought, well, that's pretty fascinating for a proposition. What if we were to substitute a poem for a human sense? What if we were to substitute a work of art for a human sense, right? So then we're just kind of making a simple substitution in this formulation of Marx's, whereby it would be the capacity of the poem or the artwork, right, to sense something in the world that we can't yet cognize intellectually or discursively, right? So to actually think of the poem or the artwork, and I imagine there are folks here in this room that work in various modes with different mediums, whether you're a writer, a painter, a sculptor, you do installation work, you're a performance artist, right? Regardless, we're thinking about the artwork in relation to a world that we can't yet really intellectually grasp, right? But there's something that the poem or the artwork can do that can enable us to think something that we otherwise could not think, right? Okay, so that's a first proposition. So let's keep that in mind in response to the question, like, why poetry, why art, why art, right? So the second, and this may have come up, I know that Miranda and Eirik were telling me that you had some engagement, those of you in the Literary Toolkits class had some engagement with the work of George Oppen. So George Oppen in 1968 wrote this, what's become a very important poem. 1968, it won the Pulitzer Prize, called Of Being Numerous, and the first tercet, the first 3 lines of this poem are, there are things, right, and to see them is to know ourselves. There are things, and to see them is to know ourselves. I actually want to ask you all to write, if you have paper and pen, most of you do, just write those 3 lines. So there are things, line break, and to see them, line break, is to know ourselves. And I'm just going to ask you to we'll just take maybe 40 seconds, and I'll ask you simply to ask yourself and respond in writing, well, what is it that you think you might need to see today, now, under current conditions, in order to know yourself, or whatever it is you might imagine to occupy that position called a self, right? What is it that you feel you would need to see in order to know yourself? Anyone want to shout out any responses? This chair?
Telescope. My thoughts. My thoughts. The muscles around your eyes. Spirits. Lorded shoes.
Sorry?
Lorded shoes.
Heather boas.
Finance.
Ah. Who said finance? There's a little telepathy here, right? A little telepathy. Anyone else want to shout something out before I rush on? Did someone just say that? Did I hear the other?
Yeah.
Who said the other? Right on. Yeah. Okay, that's good. So let's keep this question in mind too. I think as I proceed, given the fact that I am extemporizing, I just need to trust that there will emerge a constellation of ideas, questions, propositions, right? The relations between them may not be explicitly drawn, but my hope is that that constellation will be implicit and we'll all begin to sense connections emerging over the course of the next hour, right? One of my responses to that question, perhaps along the lines of finance, given the fact that finance is a profound abstraction, right, that has ramifications in the most material, the most concrete dimensions of our everyday life world, right? And the notion of other or otherness, right? I think these are two ideas that I heard among you all that have had some influence on my own thinking. Right? So what I thought I would do is kind of guide us through my two recent collections. Eirik mentioned this book called Placeholder, which is a cross-section or a drawing from all four of my volumes of poetry. But I thought I would talk you through or narrate some of my own thinking around my process with respect to the book called Music for Porn and then Commonplace. And I think both of these books are responding to both the Marxian proposition and the Oppen tercet in different ways. So with respect to Music for Porn, I'm just going to talk a little bit about where this book, not so much where it came from, but where it took me. Right? And the volume is very much engaged with my own provisional response to that question of, well, what is it that I might need to see in order to know this thing that I might want to call myself? Right? And my initial way of provisionally responding to that, well, you know, the things that I feel I would need to see are things that are so profoundly withheld, right, from immediate perception, right? Whether we're talking about finance, right? Although we experience and we can perceive the effects of finance, right? Its actual machinations are somehow obscured, abstracted, withdrawn from immediate perception, right? Similarly, scenes of war, right? And specifically in the volume called Music for Porn, I was thinking about the body of the fallen US soldier in Afghanistan and Iraq. And the question that I was asking myself is, how am I to understand the relationship between my body and the body of someone who has been killed in a scene of war, right, under the sign of what? Right, our national interests, protection, right, that I can't exempt myself from given the fact that I benefit from living here as an American citizen. So I began to ask myself, what is the relationship between my body, my flesh, right, and a world of war that in many respects has been so profoundly abstracted in relation to our everyday lives, right? We can think it, right, but what does it mean to feel it, right? We can think that we feel it, right, but that's not actually the same as viscerally feeling something. And honestly, I'm not sure if I achieved that, but that was my desire, to understand a relationship to a body half a world away whose representation, right, especially once that body has become, sadly, a corpse, right, the representation of that body is occulted. That is to say, it's not permitted to circulate in the public sphere, right, as a matter of state policy. And that may have changed over the past couple of years, but when I was writing this work, it was a matter of state policy that images, photographic representations of US soldiers felled in scenes of battle in Afghanistan and Iraq were not to be circulated publicly, right? Even in a coffin. Pronounced dead, a soldier becomes my disappearing act. The consistency of the situation hangs on the body being a whole around which everything that appears to cohere. It's a spell that holds me in thrall, unable to distinguish my proper subject from one deceased. Being what the language doesn't want me to do, the decision to autopsy all US war casualties helps the military eliminate equipment flaws by improving a fleet of crash test dummies. Whatever words exist for this fall apart at such a stunning rate as if to protect the value of each identity, parceling properties before they can sell. Caving to these demands, I masturbate to fantasies of day laborers fucking me in the shadow of the screening station, a checkpoint beside the border's river diversion system where they're reinforcing old security fence before it can deform under a migrant's weight. I can't get hard enough for intercourse when the moment is sweet. But as soon as he asserts the fundamental right to liberty and happiness, being what my soldier has sworn to protect, I fall on my knees, take his member in my mouth, and beg him to discharge. Whatever shame I feel in the face of sovereignty is inseparable from this arousal. In a world of love and domination, sex becomes monstrous in just proportion to the monstrosity of that world. The skin being this endless organ of excitement and abuse, my own private pleasures being mere adjunct of that. Don't confuse this sentence for a proposition. Time itself, having already become a hardened artifact of the system, renders my orgasm coextensive with the demands of production. But this is neither true nor false. In other words, time is a fighter jet, the way the spirit is a bone, and the object of my rage secretes the same auratic halo. Like the best philosopher, my soldier subtracts the real from what can be thought, and this enhances his allure, makes me love him even more. Translated into military language, the point is not to shoot, but to clarify the shot. So precision bombing has penetrated my poems, and yet not even a single one of my feelings is precise. The words even less so. Put another way, the self is a coin. And while a soldier's corpse may be the limit of my world, his cock in my ass remains a vehicle of transport, the light by which I write this sentence, whose sense defies the stars. So reading that, I can only imagine, and forgive my presumption, maybe some thoughts that were running through your mind, hearing some of those lines, like what is the sexuality doing in this piece? How is it functioning? And I realize now, having read that, which comes almost at the end of the book, it could be perhaps a little shocking. But I just want to offer, my own sense of how the register of eros, the erotic, the sexual, the fantasy, is working in this writing, and as I move into the second book, Commonplace, which emerges out of the conclusion of this, about which I'll speak in just a moment, that erotic dimension becomes even more palpable, more intensified, more disturbing, more discomfiting, perhaps even problematic. So my thinking, at least at this point, and the reason why I could understand why my writing was being drawn into a sexual register, right, had a lot to do with the degree to which the bodies I was attempting to reach, if you will, or perceive a relation. We all have a relation, right? We all have a relation to bodies in scenes of war right now, right? In many, many places in the world, right? How do we begin to understand, sense that relation? Well, the degree to which those bodies are occulted, withdrawn, unavailable for representation, right? Makes them all the more unavailable for even imagining, right? Imagining what it might be to feel, to touch, to care, right? So I felt the need to find a commensurate, almost like a commensurate reach. The degree to which the bodies are withdrawn, I have to reach even further, harder, right? I had to find some kind of poetic artifice, if you will, right, to match, right, to a certain degree, right, the degree to which those bodies are so strenuously, so institutionally, and politically, socially withdrawn, right? So my default is often the erotic, right? That's where my writing inclines, right? And we can talk about that more if you're interested. But I'm not going to belabor that point because it's going to come up again, okay? So one thing that I found myself, the more I engaged with this material toward the completion of this book, Music for Porn, the more I felt the need to locate what we might think of as evidentiary language, right, that might denote the bodies that I was attempting to feel some relation to, right? And really, the only place one can find evidentiary language that might denote the body of a deceased soldier, in this case, but really we can think about this as any body, is lamentably in an autopsy report. Right? So I began to seek autopsy reports, specifically of fallen US soldiers, only to discover, given my naivete, that like the representations, the photographic representations of these bodies, the documentary evidence, the forensic material that might denote, right, the actual casualty is similarly withheld from public circulation. They're not available. You can't access them, right? So all I was able to locate were the reports of reports, journalistic reportage that may have had access, say, to a family on the eve of having received, right, the tragic news of a death, right? And often that would be accompanied by such a report, right? So the information, the language that I began to draw on toward the end of this work emerged through mediated reports, right? And again, this comes back to the question of what is it, right? There are things, and to see them is to know ourselves. Well, what happens when the thing we need to see in order to know ourselves, right, is precisely a body, right? Withdrawn, occulted, unavailable for representation, right? Where the only thing we can access is the most highly mediated, right? Report of a report of a report, right? So I began to work with this language toward the completion of this book in a section called Obscene Intimacies. And I'll read you a few of these, and then I'm actually going to play a couple audio files. So this comes toward the end of the book, and here I'm beginning to draw on some of the evidentiary language that I've received through various mediated accounts. Against this backdrop of totality, figures having found relief as I have in my bowels, so bloated with event, who walks away from it as I do, having walked away from theater, the barnyard filth and debris lodged down deep in soft tissue, his severed genitals flown wider still, shored against ruin, gaps wedged or driven into being, there being no deep inside spectacle. My soldier died last September, hit by Taliban mortar while trying to fix a tank. Tread, his father feeling the boy had been murdered by insurgents, wanted to see the post-mortem report to verify other accounts he heard about the 24-year-old's death. So offer comfort I say to myself. Say the reservist died instantly when a hot piece of shrapnel tore through the boy's flak vest into his chest before breaking in two, with one piece lodged in the left aorta, leaving the other piece lodged in left lung, a mute and uncomplaining sleep being fatal form, his figure, my decaying dream. The body appears to have been dead some time under a spell, a dream, nation, water, hood, flex cuffs, minor abrasion, subgaleal hemorrhage, bilateral frontal regions of scalp, intramuscular hemorrhage of anterior aspect, and nothing internal, evidence of trauma scant, cause of death indeterminate, toxicology report negative for alcohol and drugs. I long for where your pleasure lies. I'm going to play 2 audio files of 2 short poems, a total of 3 minutes, from Music for Porn, just to share with you, to shift gears a bit and share with you some collaborative work that I was doing with a musician, a friend of mine, Christian Passera, a French musician in Paris. So these are 2 poems, and the first one is called Non-Sound, a Musical, and I think this really illustrates some of the ideas that Eirik was sharing with you about prosody, poetry, and music. So let's see, I hope this will work.
Non-sound, a musical. No song on sight, these airs sing what things can't be, needs forgotten, grafted mains to metal, scored hues whose breath resides in place. Where matter, voided, voices still, the things I've abolished beat down ears with instruments. Plump dealers produce. Extracted breath by force returns tones, sounds, silence dead in a cavity. My mouth collects their parts in words, bones, graft lives, undo deeds themselves struck out. Down subjects don't matter by accord, threat, menace, refuse no living sounds, residues, breath resides in anthem noise. Choppers, ammo, floods a sky, not being sky, and the sea's vast plains, whose military sonics sow the ground, what we produce, trains ears on spectral sounds surround us, systems sing in private mouths, deeds, force, airs, menace, ears, metal tones, things we've muted living, hums blown bits into being, bone, ash, all our dead remains, residual song, refusing, clings to breath, wrecked mouths, tubes, absent horns, beats, silence, on sight, a music we never hear. One soldier returned in a state of decomposition so severe that viewing his body was impossible only 3 days after his death, being bio-ruin's outer ring, what horizon, whose sensation, my rim, a negative imprint, the world image, collateralized risk mechanism, a current military procedure to pack fallen soldiers in ice. Then transport them to U.S. Air Force Base for a 3-step process. 1, identification, which includes DNA, dental, and fingerprinting. 2, autopsy, and 3, preparation, i.e. embalming the body, a proper mortuary facility. Were one only in place over there, we'd have been able to say our goodbyes, but the boy was not even refrigerated.
So I'm going to segue now into the project that emerged out of some of the work that you just heard. So the preface here has to do with the fact that in my quest for autopsy reports of fallen US soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq, I did locate a cache of autopsy reports that emerged out of Guantanamo Bay of detainees held at Guantanamo Bay. The ACLU was able to retrieve these documents thanks to the Freedom of Information Act when there was mounting concern about a spate of alleged suicides back around 2006, 2007. So there was a lot of suspicion around cause of death, and those suspicions enabled the ACLU to recuperate autopsy reports, which were then available, whereas, of course, autopsy reports denoting the bodies of US soldiers were not. So as an early experiment, okay, so I want to offer you just the epigraph to the postscript to this book, Commonplace, which comes from Simone de Beauvoir's Must We Burn Sade, referring to the Marquis de Sade. Better to assume the risk of evil than subscribe to this abstract good which drags so many abstract horrors in its wake. As an experiment in early 2013, I began transcribing the 2009 autopsy report of a Yemeni man who had been held in US custody since December 2001 and detained at Guantanamo Bay. Among other things, I wanted to return transcription to its roots in somatic practice, that is, to bring my body into contact with the linguistic remains of extraordinary rendition and state-sponsored death, kind of like a scribe reproducing Torah or a monk laboring over illuminated books, unable to restrain himself from spilling into the text. How would my writing, prosthetic of nerve and bone, metabolize such language in an effort to perceive my body's relation to a detainee's occulted corpse? And how might that effort allow me to feel the militarization that has captured all of our social relations? So at the time that I discovered these autopsy reports coming out of Guantanamo Bay, I was still completing music for porn. I made the decision to segregate them. I made the decision that I would not use them, right? Because I was under the impression at the time that it would be ethically improper, right? Whatever that might mean, to substitute one body for another, right? That is to say, to use an autopsy report denoting the body of a Guantanamo detainee, to draw on that language in the interest of furthering my exploration of an embodied relation to fallen US soldiers. It just seemed completely inappropriate and dishonest to do that. So I segregated that material, and as I mentioned, I only drew for music for porn on mediated reports of those reports, right? So about a year after I completed that volume, I began to return. I questioned that decision. Well, you know, the language of autopsy reports, and I know this is not pleasant. Obviously, it's a little gruesome. You know, but the reality is that the language of autopsy reports is perhaps the most fungible medical language, right, imaginable, right? They virtually sound the same, aside for minor, modest details, often the details denoting cause of death, right? But the language is substitutable, right? It's fungible. Right? You can replace one phrase for another. You know, one might call them cliches, right? Which comes from the French word that was used by printers for ready-made phrases that were just like available for the printer, so you wouldn't have to like waste time like assembling like an A, a D, an E, etc. It's like phrases that were commonly used would be pre-assembled for the printer, right? And these were called cliches, something, it's just the word to grab, right? You can just kind of grab it and use it, right? So the language of autopsy is essentially a language replete with the cliches of medical discourse, medicalized discourse, like pressed into the use of, I think it's fair to say, various forms of institutional power, right? Whether we're talking about the military or the hospital, right? These are sites of very complex but deeply felt power relations into which particular kinds of language is made use of for particular ends, right? So I began to question, like, why am I segregating? Why have I placed this material out of bounds, so to speak, right? And I wasn't sure what would come of that inquiry, that question, like, oh, why have I done this? What might it mean to actually engage with this language, this material, and the body that it denotes, that is to say, the body of a detainee at Guantanamo? Obviously, that's a point of departure that you might imagine opens onto a vast field of very difficult, problematic, in some respects, interminable questions. But the point of departure for me was a literal transcription of the report. I told myself I was going to submit my body and my time and my attention to what one might think of as an essay in duration, and that is to say, I'm just going to copy by hand, right, an autopsy report, which is terrible. Right? And in the process of doing that, I wanted to see, well, what would happen? How would that language, I began to think about this as what I think of as a metabolic transcription. Those of you who have done any work with the history of contemporary poetry, for example, might know that transcription, that is to say, making use of language that's already available in the world, is a very common contemporary practice, often associated with conceptual writing, right? And the procedure is often to just kind of go by virtue of a Google search and lift some language from various places, or lift whole texts and simply recontextualize them, right? Taking something out of one discourse and placing it within the framework of poetry to throw into relief aspects of that language that would otherwise appear totally naturalized, right? So I wanted to kind of restore the practice of transcription to a much longer history than that which is available to us by way of contemporary poetry and art practices, and actually thinking about monks and scribes, right? And the way in which anyone who has studied illuminated manuscripts in archives or has ever seen what often appears as doodles in the margins, where monks, maybe the monk's getting a little bored transcribing that ancient theological text. It just begins to doodle, right? And they're quite wonderful, right? To like sort of catch the sight of just, a moment of distraction or boredom on the part of the transcriber. And so I was attempting to use the practice of transcription to induce a kind of hypnagogic state whereby, and I really encourage this for anyone who is a writer, a poet, right, to actually use transcription, the physical act of transcription, kind of what I think of as metabolic transcription. That is to say, to bring the language as close to your body, right, as you can, right, in the interest of seeing what it will do there, right? How's it going to metabolize, right? So I wanted to see what this language would provoke, and it led me to a place where I could actually begin to dream. It was like dreaming on the page, where it's suddenly you arrive at a place of profound boredom or a need for distraction or numbing because the material is so painful and incomprehensible that it begins to arouse material that would otherwise be relegated to, say, the unconscious, right? And you begin to dream on the page rather than censoring yourself when you're writing and keeping all the extraneous stuff out because you're disciplining your attention in relation to a text that you are charged with transcribing. I wanted to allow all that stuff to come in, right? Let it come in. Don't keep it out. And the result of that, well, now I can say the result of that is this book called Commonplace that led me into some very, really difficult material. I'll read you just a bit of it, maybe a couple of pages before I go elsewhere. Okay, So I'll read this. This is a lineated poem, and I think what you'll see is it sounds, in some respects, some of the prosodic techniques that I'm using are very similar to the prosodic techniques that I used in the obscene intimacies at the conclusion of Music for Porn, which provoked a real problem for me, right? And I'll share that with you in just a second, but here's the poem. One civilian detainee was found unresponsive with a ligature or plastic band around my cock, a bottle ring, pops, pigeon death, incel behavior, health unit, joint task force, Guantanamo, 2,200 hours. When the ligature gets cut, I come without remorse on the source of light, his electric body being banished to mulch, organic composition, capital dividing luminous flux, a rumor, a burden of labor having fallen away from the tendency of profit to rise and fall with the quality of radiance, his cock, the way any man will use my hands like vitreous fluid, his urine emits so diffused a glow, no needle-like beam through pores of junk, no evidence of trauma resuscitation efforts begging immediate organization to turn blood back to military cargo. My skin now shares with a tank. So one thing that concerned me here was that I noticed that I was performing a similar set of poetic or prosodic operations to craft these poems. And I found that very disturbing, right? I didn't want to write just the same book that I wrote in Music for Porn, especially given the fact that the material that I was attempting to engage with and the relations I was struggling to feel, right, were very, very different, despite the fact that they're mediated by the same set of militarized global crises. They're very different, right? They're very specific to their own locations, to their own histories, et cetera. And I was writing the same poems. Right? Now, any of you who are engaged in various art practices know that as an artist or a poet, you sort of have a set of defaults, you have a set of tics, right? Things that you can pretty much rely on over time, that you've perhaps cultivated. And I didn't want to simply rely on a set of tics or prosodic tropes that I had grown accustomed to using in a very different project. So this provoked a moment of crisis for me. In fact, I almost stopped writing the book. But rather than abandon those tropes, I think Eirik mentioned, thinking about a trope or a turn, right, which is really all a trope is, a verse, a way of turning your language, right? I thought, what if we were to think of our tropes or our tics as little engines, right? And rather than abandoning them, these are engines that I've taken a lot of time and care to create these things that, for better or worse, can do kind of cool things, right? They helped me write what I think are some pretty good poems. But rather than abandoning them because they were becoming too easy to use, I thought, well, why not just rev them up, right? If they're little engines, let's see how fast they can go and send them into the wall so that they kind of crash and burn, right? So that you'll never be able to use them again. You're going to put them out of their misery, and you're going to relieve yourself of ever having to even encounter this question like, I'm just writing the same fucking thing over and over again, right? So I wanted to actually create like catastrophic conditions for my own tropes and destroy them, right? And in a way, what I was sending them into was the wall, the obstacle, right, that kept me from the very thing I was attempting to reach, right, which is another human body, right, that I was desperately desiring to at least begin to feel what it might feel like to experience care, touch, visceral solidarity, right, with an incarcerated body interminably withheld, like literally, right? So I thought, well, I'll send these things into the wall, and actually when they reach that wall, right, there'll be an impact, and that impact becomes the equivalent of like a line of verse, right, or a sentence in prose, right, that makes the obstacle between yourself and the body that you're attempting to reach palpable, right? So that's kind of where it began, and the book is it's extreme, It's difficult. But that's a little bit of the thinking behind its difficulty. Where are we for time? 30 minutes left. 30 minutes left. So, okay. So here's the thing. 30 minutes. Okay, I was going to share with you this thing, and then we can decide. Like, we can talk, or I don't have to read anymore, right? We can just talk. But, I was here on this campus, like a long time ago, and I've been writing about that experience in a way that I kind of wanted to share a little bit of that with you. Because it was fucked up. I love this place. I love this place. But, it's like, it was kind of troubling in some respects. And I thought that could be interesting to share, but we only. What do you think? Okay, I'll share a little bit of this. It actually helps. Okay, so I destroyed my tropes. It's like, what do I do? Like, I'm a writer and I need to like keep writing. What am I going to do now, right? Well, one thing I realized, and I narrate this in Commonplace at a particular moment. One thing I realized was that all the attention that I had been giving to dead bodies, really, soldiers and detainees for the past 10 years, it took me a long time to realize this, but those bodies were actually stand-ins or proxies for bodies that were perhaps much more close to me, much more intimate, that I lost during the 90s, especially related to the AIDS crisis. And that I was having a hard time, actually. And this is not to subtract the integrity of these works. These works are about what they are about, specifically. But when I began to reflect, I began to realize that these works are also have kept me from writing about something else, right? And specifically the loss of my first love, James, in 1995. Very, very traumatic for me, very difficult. And I haven't really been able to access the material of that trauma for 20 years. It's a long time. Until recently. And in part, I realized that's why I needed to destroy my tropes, right? I needed to destroy them so that I wouldn't have the temptation of continuing this subterfuge, if you will. Not to say that it doesn't generate interesting work. I like my books, right? But I also know that there were other things I needed to attend to. Okay, so this is a long project called My Augustine, kind of drawing on Augustine's Confessions, but also the work of Jean Genet and his Thief's Journal and Funeral Rites. And this is a moment I'm actually reflecting on my own experience as a young thief in the early 90s. I stole a lot of shit in San Francisco. And thought that I should write about that. And it got me to a place where I ended up writing about my time here at Evergreen, right? And the reason I ended up writing about my time here at Evergreen, because there was a moment when I was sharing this with Miranda, I believe, last night, was I? There was a moment of apprehension. I was arrested, right? I was arrested. So a security guard sort of grabs me, right? And rather than resisting, I gave in. It was like this dust. It's like feeling my body just kind of become docile, like this. It was very interesting to me. But it brought back a memory of my time here at Evergreen where the exact opposite thing happened, where I was on the verge of being arrested, but rather than giving in, I ran. And this is about running. Okay? Now that I've rehearsed for you the submission to which my body had fallen, I'm struck by how willingly my narrative gives in to private security. I was arrested by a private security guard at Tower Records, right? So it's not really an arrest. They want to believe they can arrest you, but they really can't, right? Right? That's the illusion. But our bodies believe that they can, right? That's a weird thing, right? That's the docile body, right? So I'm struck by how willingly my narrative gives in to private security, as if authority's cheesy masquerade were kin to a seduction, wherein I'd been happily drawn, as though the touch of a hired thug, whose attraction to my body confirmed a guilt whose power had already captured my person from within, and was therefore welcome, if not desired, to displace, however momentarily, a violence I otherwise act upon myself, or as if with security management's hand upon my wrist, I'd be synchronized or integrated with all of my selves for the first time ever upon the threshold of an arrest whose interpolating hail echoed isomorphically with my inner voice, all of which recalls another scene, an occasion not too distant in memory from my enterprising effort that afternoon at Tower Records when, rather than giving in to an arresting fate without fuss and without even a soupçon of resistance, rather than performing the total docility of an overcoded bodily schema whose repertoire of gestures suggests an alienation from oneself as to resemble a state-sponsored choreography wired to the rate of profit, I simply ran. It was a month or two after James and I had left Olympia for San Francisco when I returned to Washington for a visit, really just a pretext to take a long drive with Jean, whose drag persona, Portia Manson, was more in keeping with her exquisitely elaborated life world. Portia was my first radical fairy friend, creator of Hippie Dick, a DIY zine for granola fags, as well as Film at 11, a low-tech VHS fairy porn production operation that gratified a pre-internet niche market whose patrons were drawn from, well, reading zines like Hippie Dick. Portia and I slept together once, and that quality of touch was so tender and affectionate, but I was too inexperienced and lacked the requisite body hair to inspire Portia's appetite for bears, and though I was determined to leave my own hippie days behind upon leaving for Evergreen, shaving both my head and my beard in a gesture of molting, I've always regretted being too distant from my own desire to open myself to Portia's fairy rituals, which might have nourished my understanding of ecstasy. It wasn't long after our adventure that Portia withdrew to the North Bay, San Francisco North Bay, to live peacefully and cheaply before dying of HIV-related meningitis in 1993. On the eve of my visit, I learned from my friend Mary that the administration at the Evergreen State College had ordered, by administrative fiat, the removal of a photography exhibition, at once mournful and militant, by a gay student whose project displayed a series of identical erect penises enlarged in photographic negative, surrounded by rhinestones glued to Kodak paper. An infinitely repeatable gesture of memorialization, embracing sex and glamour during the time of AIDS. Despite the exhibit's clear contextual framing as a response to HIV-related crises, the Dean of Student Affairs, at the time a guy named Stone Thomas, referred to his decision to remove the exhibition as, and I quote, an act of solidarity protective of student diversity, as it bowed to pressure, sadly, from the Women's Student Organization, which had complained that having to view the exhibition in the Community Activities Building was the equivalent of being raped in a public space. I was not there to witness the exhibition before it was removed, and have only since reconstructed it in a fantasia of imagined fact. Perhaps it was the photographer's own penis, I thought, the replicated series of which would have proffered an allegorized feature of the virus itself, that is, replication, the exhibition thereby grieving and celebrating its own life under the sign of imminent death. And yet the photos defied psychology by hewing to the surface of its repeated image, an isolated cock, seemingly detachable, alienated from its body, like a prosthetic floating in a galactic sea of rhinestone, refusing all the familiar tropes of intimate mourning and opting instead for an anonymous expression of grief and rage made all the more vulnerable to suppression and censorship for that refusal. Repeated, the phallic image appears like a disembodied artifact of chiseled granite, a marmoreal abstraction sculpted in gray space, recalling how pieces of the Andalusian landscape in Genet's own Thief's Journal, whose, quote, sharp rocks gnawed the sky and ripped the azure, unquote, incited him to hardness. As rhinestones splinter into fragments of night, I am amazed by such delicacy, so fine and chaste, refracting now in kitschy rays of love. The artist's work refuses to offer a softened vision meant to console. Instead, the exhibit offers a radical exteriorization of mourning that declines to rehearse an attachment to individual loss. While no doubt animated by the artist's private love and loss, the exhibition declines to privilege the particularity of its own privacy, a particularity that might then paradoxically converge with the universality of everyone's most private moments, thereby assuaging comfort by offering itself for everyone's individual identification. For while the artist's vision is collective, it is adamantly not universal. Recalling Frank O'Hara's essay, Personism, the artist affirms, quoting O'Hara, love's life-giving vulgarity, unquote, by refusing to be distracted by the intimate feeling toward any one person. Instead, those vulgar energies intensify as love arouses and organizes its erotic energies centrifugally toward others, becoming all the more personal by losing the center of personal gravity. What results is an abstract exteriorization capable of politicizing loss without having to rehearse one individual's lamination to an identifiable subject, a rehearsal whose aim would be to comfort, an aim more consonant with administrative power. But instead, the exhibition staged an exquisitely vulgar memorialization without consolation. Like the artifact of a survived grief, a shard of costumed stone becomes a cold, abstract detail. At the same time, while risking its own cheap sentiment, the hollowed-out detail, fugitive ornament of a violent universality that would otherwise subordinate it as kitsch, becomes the vehicle for genuine feeling. Moreover, I want to suggest, when the illusion of personal depth is dispelled and exteriorized, the promise of politics, the contestation over shared contexts and universal meanings becomes operative. The logic is kin to that of camp, whereby, as Jonathan Dollimore puts it in a book called Sexual Dissidence, quote, theatricality, irony, and the seeming absurdity of extreme feeling, here manifest in the form of rhinestoned or costumed erections, converges with what Dollimore refers to as authenticity, intensity, and the fierce assertion of extreme feeling. That is, depth becomes surface, and in becoming so, intense emotion becomes an attack. This was not lost on the Evergreen administrator, who chose to censor this exhibit under the signs of diversity and community, regents of a universal value administered at the expense of every particular. This was not an art exhibit whose photographs relied on, quote, conventional representations of loss that would outlast the epidemic. No, these photographs were neither universal nor timeless, and this lack of basic common sense criteria for shared cultural value offered everyone who might wish to censor or defund challenging art a perfect alibi to do just that. In other words, this was not good art, in part because it did not ask the viewer to identify politely with the artist's mourning in the interest of social decorum. It was rather defiant, like, fuck you for thinking you might domesticate this. And these cocks refused to cover up. Even if the exhibit's content was not immediately recognizable as political, the administration's decision to remove the work politicized it unwittingly, valorizing, volatilizing, and transforming the space in which it had appeared before disappearing. The Evergreen administrator made no reference to AIDS in the public statement it used to disseminate its alibi for removing the, quote, scandalous exhibition, a statement that exploited our genuine desire for community to screen a harmful logic of immunity and social hygiene, a logic that arguably supports the very logic of disease it is said to combat. Was this silence around HIV/AIDS due to the fact that the photographs were themselves so dependent on their context, so totally penetrated by a cultural catastrophe that could then be ignored because, despite their contextual captions, the images themselves bore no indexical sign, no transparent mark of the crisis to which it responded, and whose ironies, indecipherable tonalities, or noise produced when incompatible discourse communities collide, enabled a dismissal of the work's concern. In any case, this is how I've come to remount the exhibition in my imagination. While upon arriving in Olympia, I immediately found my friend Mary along with our friends Pete and Steve, and together we expressed our rage about the admin's response and the rhetoric of community that the dean deployed as his crutch, quoting again, protecting diversity in accord with community standards for process and accountability, in order to justify a repressive censorship. We decided to stage an action in the cab's art space itself, where the vitrines remained empty and thereby transfigure one crime scene into another. We'd call our intervention "A Happy End is Out of the Question," after an essay by Maurice Blanchot. Our plan was to break into the cab, well, not break in exactly, as Steve was still in possession of a key he hadn't returned after he and James and a small cadre of others, they were called the James Gang by the administration and had been chased from their student government positions after trying unsuccessfully. This is something after trying unsuccessfully. Okay, so my first love, James, was the equivalent of the student president. I don't know what they call that. Student body president, something like this, right? And together, right, they were trying to enact something that the administration did not like, and that's this. They had been chased from their student government positions after trying unsuccessfully to reappropriate student activity fees. You know, those S&A, they call them that still, S&A fees? So they wanted to reappropriate S&A fees, placing budgetary responsibility for those monies directly into student hands for democratic reapportioning. And if you all haven't thought about that, you should, right? And so we decided to vandalize the exhibition space using a highly corrosive adhesive with which we would paste our inflammatory flyers to the glass vitrines that had housed the photos, covering the entirety of the surface area in a way that would render the glass cabinets forever opaque or require rather expensive replacement. Our polemic linked Evergreen's act of censorship for liberal ends to Jesse Helms's war against morally offensive art. We had like little slogans like this: community process and the Helms crusade, community process at the Evergreen State College and the Jesse Helms campaign. What's the difference? Right? Read one of our flyers, which also drew directly from Maurice Blanchot's essay, quoting Blanchot, "Art can never be comprehended or reduced to any law, whether political, moral, or temporal, or eternal." And another quote, "Art is what is most ruthless, indifferent, and unfaithful," unquote. Finally, we hung an immense banner from the balustrade of the cab's atrium in full view of everyone entering the building that read, "A happy end is out of the question," and of which we were terrifically proud, even though our chosen slogan rendered any context impossible to discern. It's like you're walking like, what are they talking about? Happy end is out of the question? You know? Anyway, shortly after we, I'll rush through this. This is the climax though, right? Right. Shortly after we began to brush the corrosive glue to the glass and adhere the first of our many flyers to the vitrine, we were struck by the clear echo of footsteps in the corridor leading to the exhibition space. Not only footsteps, but the resonant voice transmitted by walkie-talkie, as well as the audible pitter-pat of the campus cops accompanying canine. They had a fucking dog, you know? It was 1 a.m. Go figure, yeah. And we froze, anticipating precisely what was about to happen, though without even a moment to consult one another and agree on a plan of action, leaving us vulnerable to our reactive defaults. It was one of those proverbial moments of suspended animation and prefiguration when a collective suddenly finds itself dispersed and stranded, having lost communication, just as the promise of community, the promise of an eros in excess of any one singular body, is negated by the false logic of immunity. That is, the logic of self-protection, the logic of the individual. right? And ultimately the logic of death. Caught in the act of defacing state property, we were exposed to the most immediate violence of the state, whose prosthetic arm was en route to nail us. And while we'd thought of everything, we realized there on the precipice of too late that we'd given no consideration to the most obvious of all contingencies, the cops. Thus leaving us bare before the law, the dog, the car, the jail, the court, where we'd no doubt be tried on charges of vandalism, and rather than stand behind our act, defiantly occupying our position as we'd later lament, we allowed ourselves to be intimidated on contact with the mere sound of feet, and rather than seizing the moment's fragile opportunity to say, no, we are not afraid, we want people to know about this. Rather than interrogate the interrogation, we ran. Instead of standing by our intervention, defending our action, and making our argument, which would then have been officially documented and thus potentially mediatized, our flight gave credence to the administration's argument that this was about individual bad behavior and not about collective resistance to institutional hostility. This, of course, is the way power typically interprets its own structural violence, which gets refracted through ideologies of the individual rather than through apparatuses of subjection. I'll stop there. So, yeah.